Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to be talking about executive powers, both the formal, which are written in the Constitution, and the informal executive powers, which are not written in the Constitution but have been claimed by presidents over time, that you guys specialized in, made a poster board of, defined the power, pros and cons, and investigated a case study, sort of a presidential use of that power. So the poster boards were super impressive. You can see a couple right here, a couple of really fantastic exemplars, and I have a couple that I'm going to show you and I'm going to lift up as well. These are really well done. I wanted to sort of spend some time to kind of just rehash what you guys communicated. You guys are making presentations in class about your power, and everybody else is going to be taking notes on that power. But I wanted to provide you with a resource where you can easily access that information if you're a little bit unclear about it in class, right? So this is going to be it. I'm going to commandeer, I'm going to steal sort of the wonderful artwork that I didn't do. This is Isabella's group, wonderful drawing. This is Dahlia's. This is Brenda, Brianda, and Caitlin's group. I forgot who drew it. I think it was Brianda that drew this wonderful drawing. So I just want to give them credit, right? This is not my artistry by any means. But let's go over these presidential powers because they're pretty important. Executive privilege is this power that presidents have to protect their communications with their aides, right? They assert executive privilege. We talked about the subpoena power of Congress, where they can force people to appear before them and provide documents. Well, presidents have some protection against this investigatory oversight power of Congress called executive privilege. They've asserted executive privilege over time. It's still a bit unclear the exact contours of executive privilege. There's still like a lot of debate about how much or how little executive privilege presidents have. Obviously, if you're Congress and you want to engage in robust oversight of the president, you think the president has very little executive privilege, and if you're the president, you think that power is very extensive and protects a large number of your communications with executive branch officials, right? So in this case study, President Trump, former President Trump, talks about executive privilege. It's an interesting case study because President Trump is sort of claiming executive privilege. He no longer benefits from that executive privilege, most legal scholars believe, because he's no longer president. Over communications, there's a select committee in Congress that is investigating the January 6th riot at the Capitol, right? So they're requesting documents from several former Trump administration officials, and I'm not sure specifically who, maybe campaign workers as well, regarding the January 6th riot. And so this was an interesting case study because it's a case of a former president trying to assert executive privilege, or it seems like he's trying to get, in the article, perhaps Joe Biden to assert executive privilege on his behalf. But executive privilege, the rationale why people think it's sort of a good thing, like the pros to it, are that it provides the president and his direct aides with some level of confidentiality, right? If an aide to the president thought that their communications would just get leaked to Fox News or CNN or the New York Times or what have you, then they might not advise the president as candidly as they would otherwise, right? So some level of presidential confidentiality most people think is important, right? So that would be a pro. A con, of course, would be if a president is trying to avoid accountability and congressional oversight, an assertion of executive privilege is one way in which they can do that. Okay, so executive privilege is a hugely important power. When we're actually impeaching presidents, we're going to do a mock impeachment of several different presidents next week. You'll see its sort of relevance, particularly to impeachment. Signing statements are really interesting, but first I want to talk about another power that not every class got to do because some of my classes are smaller than others, but Commander-in-Chief. So in this one, Ritzy's group, Ritzy, Aiden, and Callie and Sebastian did a really good job. So they defined the presidential power. The president is in charge of the armed forces. So what's interesting about war powers in Congress is that Congress is given the power to declare war. That's in Article 1 of the Constitution, so it's a formal power, it's an enumerated power, and then formal presidential power is to be commander-in-chief of the armed forces, right, to head the armed forces of the nation. And so there was sort of this, remember we talked about checks and balances and separation of powers within the system, this created tension, right? The Federalist 51 argument, ambition made to counteract ambition, we can kind of see it as like, not one branch having exclusive, war powers. However, presidents over time have exercised increasing authority over war initiation, it seems, or how we conduct wars. And so this is going to be the focus of our, 9/11, the anniversary is taking place on Saturday. We are going to be watching a documentary on Friday about the U.S. detention and interrogation programs that were set up in the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, all that good stuff. But presidents have, seem to got increasing authority as Congress kind of seems to be shirking more and more of its responsibility. There's an essay that I assigned to you written in the New York Times called The Imperial Presidency that talks about this trend of the congressional branch seeming to kind of shirk away from its responsibility or from attempts to kind of oversee and police how the president actually engages in military conflict, how they commit troops and forces to military conflicts overseas, as the president seems to get increasing authority. So the commander-in-chief, as they run the executive branch, the sort of pro is that this group put it, that there's one president, and it's a good president, having them in charge of the armed forces, the central person in charge, kind of like a Federal 70 argument is important. It leads to like quick decisions. A con is that if the president is prone to bad decisions, this could be disastrous. And so the case study that they read about how Obama, a kind of survey of how Obama acted as commander-in-chief, sort of his prioritization of the expansion of the drone program, stuff like that. So that's why they drew a drone on this image. The reason why I talked about this one before I talked about this is a formal power. It says formally in the Constitution that the president's commander-in-chief. Before I talked about signing statements, is because the signing statement power, and we can see these two groups did a really good job kind of at illustrating the, this group up here, Dahlia's, Trey's, and Weezer's group up here did a really good job of sort of illustrating the sort of the implications of that, consequences of this specific instance, and sort of this political cartoon that I really, really enjoy in this group down here. And so signing statements are an informal presidential power, and Bush used them in ways that I will admit are radically different than the ways in which other presidents have used them. But nonetheless, we can see sort of like the implication or the power, if you will, of this kind of seemingly soft-sounding power. So a signing statement is essentially a statement. Laws are vague, and the president is the one charged with executing and enforcing the laws. And so they can actually write a signing statement about their interpretation of the law, like how they interpret the law and how they plan to enforce and enact the law. Sort of pro of this is we have the president's view about how they plan to enforce and execute the law, which is important. And the con of this is that it can be used, as it was used in that example that I gave this group, to sort of find a political loophole, as this group talks about, where the president can interpret laws in order to sort of rewrite them, so to speak. And so this example was very interesting because this one was an example of Congress was getting reports of detainees that were being abused, that were subjected to torturous treatment. Congress passes a law banning inhumane acts against detainees, no matter where they are around the world. And President Bush realizes that Congress passed it by a veto-proof majority, so he doesn't want to veto the bill. So he signs off on the bill, and essentially in the Pulitzer Prize-winning case study that I gave these students, there's kind of a lot of legal arguments, right? But what President Bush does is he issues a signing statement saying, essentially, oh, I agree with the sentiments of this law, but this law too could potentially come in, and it's important to abide by these laws, but this law too could potentially come in conflict with my authority, my constitutional authorities as commander-in-chief. Right, so on Friday, we're going to watch that documentary, Taxi to the Dark Side, where we'll see that there were several people in the Bush administration that believed that there were little to no constraints on the executive, on the president, in times of war and in arenas of war. So this is a hugely important, case study, very interesting case study that takes a seemingly simple power of this power to issue signing statements and really shows sort of its implications. Right? So this is a picture of a shackled detainee. We'll talk about sort of the techniques on Friday that were used against a range of detainees and people captured in the war on terror. And this is a cool political. And I didn't. These kids came up with this by themselves. Where we see that Congress passes a law, torture ban passed, and then Bush kind of says, yes, but no, because he uses a signing statement to sort of get around the torture ban. All right, I think this will be part one, or can I try to finish this? Oh, here's like a list of all the powers. I don't know if you want to pause it so you can get the definitions. So here we can see some great posters. Y'all did a really good job. This is Alex's. Alex is a really talented drawer. Really appreciate his drawing. Executive privilege again, pardon power. This is an interesting one. I love them. I love the posters. Great job. We're going to go with this one for pardon, or maybe the Kodak Black one, because I didn't know who Kodak Black was until you all pointed out that President Trump pardoned him, or former President Trump pardoned him. A definition is right here. It's the use of executive power that exempts the individual to whom the pardon was given from punishment, right? So it's a hugely important power, and it's a hugely controversial power. And some of you said, the pros of the pardon power is it allows presidents to essentially absolve people of guilt, or, give people a get-out-of-jail-free card that potentially deserve it. So some of you talked about, maybe you want pardons for people that end up in prison for drug offenses, right? For, using weed or stuff like that, and or trafficking, that types of stuff, right? So that's a potential use of the pardon authority. Maybe if you become president, you could use that. And then the cons would be some of you kind of like some of the people President Trump was pardoning, but then you took objection to some of the whole list of the groups that I gave the case study to. Some of you kind of said, well, a lot of the people that he pardoned had a lot of political connections and stuff like that to him. So that's potentially a drawback, right? It's a hugely important power, that it's a formal power. It's written in the Constitution. The president has the power to pardon and commute sentences. And then chief diplomat, the president can obviously act as the chief diplomat, acts as the chief diplomat for the United States. They engage in relations with foreign leaders and other heads of states. They engage in talks, and this one, the group drew former President Trump again. I think you guys like drawing Trump because I guess he's easy to sort of draw, or not easy to draw, but like you can like draw him as a cartoon very easily. And then Kim Jong-un by a rocket. And this is a very great job from this group. Chief Diplomat Kata did this one. I like this one, right? It's just showing that, she was down a lot of people too. I know she would have came up with a better picture if she had more people in her group. That's the signing statement again. Executive privilege again. This is a good job, George. And some other ones. This was executive agreement. This one's interesting because executive agreements are essentially a get around. It's an informal presidential power that's been claimed by presidents. It's not explicitly written in the Constitution. So for treaties, you need 2/3 of the Senate to ratify a treaty. It's an international agreement. But executive agreements is essentially the executive, the president, committing with another, perhaps acting as the chief diplomat of the United States, using his formal powers to commit to a political agreement with another country, as maybe enacting, with the authority and powers that they have. We'll talk about executive orders later, to talk about how President Obama specifically sort of engaged in a political agreement with the Paris Climate Accord. It wasn't a treaty, to attempt to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. And so it has, it's binding like a treaty, but the thing about executive agreements is they're more fragile because the next president could come in and rescind the executive agreement. So there's a fragility to executive agreements. All right, I hope that this is, a decent overview of sort of the powers that we've gone over in class. I wish you all the best. Bye.